let's get straight into the question of the day. Is Christmas a Christian festival?
Yes, absolutely it is. But I entirely understand why you ask the question, because, of course, Christmas also stands in a continuum of celebrations of light amid the darkness of the winter solstice that is a lot older than Christianity. And so there is perhaps a sense in which, particularly recently, there's been an emphasis on the way in which Christians are supposed to have purloined the date of Christmas, purloined lots of the rituals that surround it. And so we have kind of arrived at this paradoxical sense in which Christmas, this clearly very Christian festival, is also described as a very pagan festival. And so the tension there absolutely is a very interesting one.
So the sort of accusation is then that it's actually a kind of a festival that's as old as the ages, in the darkest point of the winter, and the Christians basically nicked it.
Yes, I mean, at its most reductive, that's the kind of the Dan Brown argument, the argument that you get in the Da Vinci Code, that sinister Christians, kind of like evil monopolists, look around at the competition and take them over and asset strip them and steal the best aspects, which is a kind of very, very 21st century capitalist take on the whole thing. I mean, that is not how things, I think, great festivals arise. But having said that, I think it's absolutely clear that particularly if you are, in a country like Britain, where the days get really very, very short, the urge to celebrate with light and with heat, and particularly in a pre-industrial society where the land outside is cold and frigid and barren, to celebrate with food and drink is very intense.
In a piece you've written, which we have today on Unheard, you paint a picture for us of King Athelstan. Yeah. Tell us about that. Give us the scene.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for this commission to write about Christmas. And so I've chucked in all kinds of things that I'm particularly enthusiastic about. So Athelstan is the first king of England, is one, and another is Stonehenge and the Stonehenge landscape, about which I've also written for you, particularly in the context of the government's plan for a tunnel. And so I begin with Athelstan holding festive court at the town of Amesbury in 932, and we know from his charters that he was there.
Christmas 932.
Christmas 932, and he issues two charters on Christmas Eve, one to Shaftesbury Abbey, one to a thane of his called Alfred, granting them both land. And this is a kind of what kings do at Christmas. They sit in state, they wear their crown, they offer largesse, so they feast their followers, but they give grants of land as well. And the reason that this conjunction of Athelstan being in Amesbury for Christmas struck me is that also in Amesbury there is a pool called Blickmead, what we call Blickmead. And it's significant because it's a warm spring, so it never freezes over. And right next to Blickmead, archaeologists, the great archaeologist David Jakes, has discovered a Mesolithic settlement. So to put that in perspective, that's 10,000 years ago, that's 8,000 BC. So this settlement dates back to a period when nomads are moving into Britain in the wake of the ice walls retreating as the Ice Age comes to an end. So Blickmead, this settlement by Blickmead marks the beginnings of continuous settlement in Britain, and specifically in Amesbury. Why are they settling there? What's the significance of it? Well, it must be that amid the ice and the snow of what was still effectively a tundra, to have a warm spring must have seemed a kind of marker of something sacral. And all the more so because actually if you throw a white stone into this spring, it comes out pink. So I'm sure you could come up with some kind of, this is a manifestation of some god. So presumably, in the depth of winter, this would have been a particularly precious place to camp by. And we know as well from David Jakes' discoveries there that clearly great feasts were held there, because large numbers of bones of animals, and particularly the bones of aurochs. And the aurochs was a kind of the prototype of the domesticated cow, but
Big,
was
it's a massive,
vast,
yeah.
absolutely hulking and huge. I mean, it's extinct now. Went extinct in Britain in, I think, the Bronze Age. But it would have fed up to 200 people, a single aurochs carcass.
So we're getting the sense then on these historically significant Salisbury Plains, people have been celebrating the midwinter feast in various ways for a really very long time.
So, for 10,000 years, presumably, if indeed, as it looks like, these settlers at Blickmead were feasting on aurochs. And of course, in between that settlement at Blickmead and Athelstan turning up in 932 AD, you've got Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is a couple of miles away from Blickmead and Amesbury. And that also clearly bears witness, much more clearly than Blickmead does, to the celebration of the solstice. Stonehenge is famously aligned to the summer and the winter solstice. And we know, again, that the solstice seems to have been a time for great feasting because Durrington Wells, which is a Neolithic site, again, a couple of miles from Stonehenge, you have the bones of pigs and cattle, and these pigs and cattle, archaeologists can tell, were slaughtered around the time of the solstice. So again, presumably this is a great feast. So there you have a kind of line of continuity. And of course, before Athelstan, after Stonehenge, you've got the Roman occupation. And we know that the Romans likewise had these kind of festivals which were celebrated in the dead of winter. The most famous one is the Saturnalia, which was a celebration of Saturn, the father of Jupiter, who was believed by the Romans to have presided over a golden age. And so his festival was all about kind of bringing back the golden age, the time when there had not been hierarchies, when there had not been want. And so for kind of 2 to 5 days after the festival of Saturn on the 17th of December, you would have these kind of riotous celebrations. You'd have people handing out presents, you'd have masters waiting on slaves, you'd appoint lords of misrule. The Romans were very keen on nuts for some reason. They were always eating nuts at their celebrations.
So far, if you don't mind me saying, this is almost the case for the prosecution on the Christian element, because we've talked about from the 10,000 BC, we've talked about Stonehenge, then we jumped over, we went to the Romans and straight to Athelstan. The character we haven't yet mentioned, we haven't yet put the Christ back into Christmas here. We haven't mentioned anything to do with the Christian story, which is your expertise. So now tell us why Christmas is actually something more than just the Christian version of a festival that's been celebrated over millennia.
Okay, so how does the birth of Christ fit into this? Well, there is a problem, of course, because if you read the Gospels and the story of the Nativity only appears in 2, Luke and Matthew, there's no real clue as to what time of year Jesus is born. And so this is why recently, the assumption has come about that as the church grows, as its power grows, as it kind of moves in on pagan celebrations, pagan gods, there is an attempt to essentially elbow these celebrations aside, appropriate them, take them over. And the argument is that the god Mithras, who is conventionally described as the great rival to Christ, if the world had not been Christian.
What tradition is Mithras from?
So Mithras, well, this is part of the confusion, because you will read not just in the Da Vinci Code, not just in kind of new atheist memes on the internet, but even in very scholarly works, that Mithras is born on the 25th of December. There is actually no evidence for this at all, but you can see where the confusion arises, because one of the titles of Mithras is Sol Invictus, which means unconquered sun. And there is a quite distinct god called Sol Invictus, a Syrian god, who it's possible that his birthday was celebrated on the 25th of December. The evidence for that is kind of ambiguous.
Potentially just a confusion.
But so it is an absolute snarl and confusion. But you can see how it becomes quite a neat story when it gets packaged and trimmed, and certain kind of, inconvenient facts are ignored and certain other ones are pulled in. You get this idea that the birthday of Mithras was 25th of December. This and this basically is why. Now,
so what's the truth?
Okay, so I think that is not the case. I think all the evidence that is stacked up for that, and I talk about that in the article, I don't think it holds water. So I think that the reason that we celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December is for deeply Christian, theological, scriptural reasons, and it has to do with a kind of an inheritance of assumptions about the way that God structures time that Christians and Jews in the early Christian centuries both hold to, and that is that there is a kind of symmetry that Jews believe that the date that the world begins is also the date that Israel's redemption will be given. And it becomes believed by Christians that the day that of Christ's death is also the day of the incarnation, the day of his conception, the day that the divine enters the fallen earth. And already by AD 200, you have Christian scholars, so Tertullian, notoriously scabrous Christian scholar who lives in Carthage, is saying that by the Roman calendar, this date, the date of Christ's death, the date of his conception, is the 25th of March.
Which is Easter, roughly.
So the
festival of Easter falls...
So Tertullian is deriving this date from the Passover calculation. So from the Jewish calendar, the date of the Passover, so that's how you can kind of work out the date. And he works out that it's the 25th of March. And basically this calculation beds down, particularly in the western half of the empire. So this becomes the favoured date.
For the incarnation.
For the incarnation and for the death of Jesus. And the two are kind of are symbolically interlinked because time itself is structured by the sacral, by the birth and the death of Christ. So if you want to work out from this the date of Christ's
birth,
the
maths in my head. Yeah.
And you assume that a pregnancy lasts 9 months, then you arrive at the 25th of December. And that seems to me a vastly more plausible explanation for why we celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December than kind of drawing in bogus talk about Mithras or unconquered sons. Because although it's clearly the case that the potency of Christmas for us as for previous generations lies in the way that it's framed by the darkness of winter, that the light comes into the darkness. The people who walk in darkness see a great light. And that does indeed align it with all kinds of other traditions, festivals, and so on. The particular connotations that Christmas has and the way that it's been framed and the way that it has generated a mythic resonance over the past 2,000 years seems to, it doesn't seem to me remotely controversial to argue this, depends on the way that the Christian story has been told and the way that Christian theology has evolved.
So there we have it. We have reclaimed Christmas for Christianity in some respect there.